So, in unsurprising news, the United States has slapped yet more sanctions on Cuba, right? Because obviously a 60-plus year embargo is not enough, right? When someone doesn't do they're told to, when they don't bend the knee to Uncle Sam, you have to keep slapping them and making their population suffer for centuries. So, let me read you this announcement from Secretary of State Skinny Pompeo, aka Blinken. He says, "We are imposing further sanctions on senior Cuban officials and the head of Cuba's prison system, where protesters unjustly imprisoned face abuse and abysmal conditions. We will continue to promote accountability for the Cuban regime's violence and violations of human rights." Now, I find this fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm so happy to hear this commitment from Skinny Pompeo and the United States to human rights, especially on Cuban soil, right? It's very invigorating to hear that they care about unjust imprisonment and abysmal conditions, especially when the United States runs a torture camp on Cuban soil, of all places. What a coincidence, right? Right? Just the world's most famous prison, Guantanamo Bay. So basically, this is where the United States sends men that it has kidnapped around the world, or its allies have kidnapped these men for them, right? So this is also something revealed by WikiLeaks, how, for example, in Macedonia, you would have, just as an example, Khaled al-Masri, I don't believe he was in Guantanamo, but the process is the same. He is a German citizen, and he was in Macedonia. The Macedonian police kidnapped him, and they gave him over to the CIA. And then the CIA took him in a plane. They put things on his ears so he can't hear anything. They blinded him with bag over his head, so remove all senses, and then they tortured him. They sexually abused him, and turns out, he was the wrong guy. Which again is kind of like a weird thing to say, like as if it was the right guy that they can still torture someone. So anyway, he wasn't even the right guy, and they still kept him for a while. And then because of WikiLeaks, because of the revelations of WikiLeaks, he was able to prove that in the European Court of Human Rights, and they found Macedonia guilty, and he had to be paid compensation. And he was not allowed to test. Well, he wanted to testify at the Julian Assange extradition hearing, and he was blocked from doing that. And I talk about this why, because even though he wasn't in Guantanamo Bay, as far as I recall, others who are in Guantanamo Bay or were in Guantanamo Bay were sent there in a similar fashion. So they were either kidnapped directly by the United States or United States allies and then handed over to the US. And they would be taken here, and they're never charged with a crime, and they're never held, there's no trial held. And to the point, one of the so-called advantages, it's frankly just evil, of doing this on Cuban soil is that the Americans can forego any sort of due process or just treatment because it's not American soil, right? So they're like, well, this is not the USA. We don't owe you any basic rights. We don't owe you due process. You don't have any habeas corpus rights or Bill of Rights, nothing. The Bush administration, it was even fighting this in court. Like they were so adamant to make sure that, people who are held in Guantanamo Bay cannot, be given due process and are just held there indefinitely, that they went to court about this, right? And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. In any case, there were several cases about this, and it just shows you the degree to which they were like, no, we want to make sure these people suffer. And this is on Cuban soil, right? So there's a treaty between Cuba and the United States where they leased the land to the United States, except that's this agreement between the U.S. and Cuba never said that they are allowed to operate a military base or a torture camp there. So they're violating the treaty. It's basically on occupied Cuban soil. And, good luck getting the U.S. out, right? Especially when you're 90 miles from the Florida coast and they've been putting you under an embargo for 90 years, so 60 years. So I spoke with the Cuban embassy, permanent mission to the UN, and I spoke with the chargé d'affaires, and I asked her about this. Like, what do you think about this issue? So this is, I think, 2-3 weeks before this announcement by Blinken, but already you remember the protests, the so-called protests in Cuba, and they were already slapping Cuba with sanctions about this, right? So let's take a look at this clip. The full interview is on the channel, by the way.
You know, it's not just with the economy and the living, the standards of living that people voice these criticisms. They also talk about human rights. They say that there are human rights abuses. They say that, the government is cracking down on protesters. I mean, what do you make of that when the United States operates a torture camp, Guantanamo Bay, on occupied Cuban territory?
Well, this is hypocrisy, cynism. First of all, the United States government has no right to criticize Cuba because they don't have moral. They better deal with their political human rights situation. They better deal with the systemic racism that they have in their society, with the protest, with the repression to the protest that took place because of this situation of racism, of the murder of Afro-American citizens. They will better deal with the situation of more than 400 journalists that were injured and wounded during this protest. So they have to deal with their own problems. And they also accuse Cuba of torturing the protesters, and which is completely...
Yes, they've been repeating this in the media, that there are people who are missing. I mean, what are these? What's behind these claims?
Yeah, no, this is completely wrong. They have been using the media to say things that completely out of order, completely false. And the case of the torture, they have saying that Cuba tortured the protesters. And I can say tell you, it's not Cuba, the country who use these sophisticated means of repression, like toxic bombs, chemical substance, and also mechanical means of repression. It is not Cuba. This has been used here in Europe and also very frequently in the US. And the press, the media, is quiet about it. And this is very cynical. And also to talk about the Guantanamo Bay, the only territory in Cuba where the human rights are constantly violated is in the base illegally occupied by the US government in Cuba, where a torture center operates.
I'm actually wondering, why is it that they're still able to maintain it? I mean, they're illegally occupying this Cuban territory, right?
Yeah, they have illegally, we have tried to get the agreement with them for they to go, but this has not been possible.
We've seen...
Right, so as you can hear from the chargé d'affaires, they won't budge. And as she correctly points out, if there's any human rights abuses and torture going on, it's in Cuban soil, it's in Guantanamo Bay by the Americans. And this is why they've tried so desperately to prevent all the prisoners there from obtaining any justice, just even basic due process, right? So they just keep them there indefinitely. They force feed them, you name it. And I can assure you there are things we don't even know about. So this is just what we know. So I find this highly ironic when Secretary of State Skinny Pompeo over here is talking about unjust imprisonment. You literally kidnap people and then put them in Guantanamo Bay. That is the pinnacle of unjust imprisonment. They don't just do that in the US. No, they do that globally, right? So all across the world, they get their allies to even kidnap people and then send them to another country. This is the height of unjust imprisonment. They are not even charged with a crime. And you talk about abysmal conditions. Do you see how they always put these bags and goggles and so on, like on their heads? I'm pretty sure that's against the Geneva Convention. When you have a prisoner of war or someone that you're detaining, you cannot put a bag on their head or blindfold them. I'm pretty sure this is against the Geneva Convention. And just a small correction. I mean, I should have maybe just been a bit more clear. When we talked about Khaled al-Masri before, he did testify in the Assange hearing, but only in written form. He wanted to testify orally, and of course, because it carries much more weight, and because of a tech issue, he couldn't testify, and I can only imagine how upsetting that is for him to have to relive these memories in his head and muster up this courage to come and testify, and then he's just like, oh, sorry, the tech doesn't work. What do you mean the tech doesn't fucking work? This is a court in the middle of London and the tech doesn't work? All of a sudden, when a CIA torture victim wants to testify? How convenient. Unbelievable. So anyway, it was just to illustrate, he's just one of many other cases. And this is really, this kind of mentality here where the US, next time they talk about cracking down on protesters or unjust imprisonment and all this stuff. I mean, just look at what they did in the George Floyd protests, for example, right? Just look at the last year in the US. I have never, ever in my life seen so much violence against protesters than I did in the last year in the United States. They say like, oh, it's happening in Cuba right now. Or they said in Syria, they're cracking down on protesters. I've never seen even a fraction of what I saw from those countries compared to what I saw in the United States in the last year. Have you? Be honest. Be real. I don't, when the New York, the NYPD was running over protesters with a car like some madmen, I've never seen anything like that in another country. The police doing that. Never. And then, I mean, that's just one example, right? There's so many examples. And, they cracked, what is it, Buffalo Springs Police Department, they pushed that old man and cracked his skull, and then they all threatened to resign if the charges weren't dropped or something, and then no one was punished for it. Or then also they attacked this journalist with a baton. I mean, come on, man. You want to talk about cracking down on protesters and unjust imprisonment? Get out of here. This is just another part of their colonial bullshit. And I really want to say something. This really has a kind of white man's burden air about it, right? It's kind of like, oh, well, we're civilized. We, the West, we are civilized, and you are uncivilized. And we have to teach you how to be civilized because you don't have women's rights, or you don't have democracy, or you don't have a political system or foreign policy that we like, or you don't know how to treat protesters. It's such a condescending mentality, right? Like, no, we know what's right. Our way is the best. We are the civilized, we're the civilized white man, boy. Yes, it's the white man's burden to civilize the heathens. And we must go around the world and educate these the poor folk, yes. What kind of bullshit is that, right? Like, that's what it is. Of course, it's not only that. There's a lot of economic corporate interests behind it, right? This is just a mask. They don't actually give a shit about being civilized or human rights. It's just, it's a cover story. The real interest is, geopolitics, corporate profits, and alliances, and so forth. So that's a real thing. But even if you fall for this and you believe that, like, what is that? What is that? Like, even if it weren't hypocritical in a way, like even if, the US was a perfect democracy and every Western country was a perfect democracy, how can you go and then call other people, basically tell them they're uncivilized? And how does that give you the right to go and invade them and then starve their populations? What kind of a sick, twisted mentality is that? That, to me, that's not being civilized. I think that's quite the opposite. If you starve populations, because when we talk about sanctions, as they're saying here, they say they're sanctioning, for example, the head of Cuba's prison system, or they're going to sanction Bashar al-Assad, or they're going to sanction, the ICC inspectors. I think that was lifted though. But it's not hurting those individuals. Do you understand? When they do that, maybe the list of people that they've sanctioned is 20 people, 50 people. That's enough to screw the entire population of millions of people, because now certain corporations, certain companies working in so banks, when we're talking about finance, when we're talking about commerce, they don't want to deal with this country anymore, right? So they see, oh, XYZ has sanctions on them. Nope, I don't want the U.S. to punish me. They might close my business in the United States because I'm still selling, I don't know, masks, computers to this country. I don't want to get punished. So they just they cut them off. And of course, masks is important for, let's say, health equipment, computers. This could be for hospitals, chips or medical equipment parts that this country cannot produce. They need to bring them from Germany maybe, or from other Western countries that only they can manufacture. And then the country's like, no, we don't want to deal with you because you're under sanctions. Then the US is going to punish me. So I'm not going to deal with you. So this is how sanctions work. And then you end up with millions of people who are cut off from medical infrastructure, and then food, basic necessities, like all of this deteriorates. And this is very important to understand. Because I even asked the chargé d'affaires, about, she brought this up too. Like, you have these stupid people who think that because the U.S. has an embargo on Cuba, that Cuba is free to go trade with other countries. Yes, technically, the problem is other countries do not want to trade with Cuba because they're scared of being punished by the U.S. This is how sanctions work. You goddamn pencil head. Like, this is really just embarrassing. And in any case, I really want you to understand my point here is that sanctions are siege warfare. And you can imagine Cuba being under sanctions for 60 years and what that does to a country. And then it's very easy to go, oh, you see, communism and socialism doesn't work. Yeah, because you're always screwing with these countries. So of course they can't function because you're sabotaging them. Like, it's... Anyway, just I'm highlighting again the hypocrisy. You really have to pay attention to the absolute... ridiculous, preposterous, utterly absurd assertions that are made by foreign dignitaries emanating from the West when they say that such and such is cracking down on protesters and we have to sanction. Look at yourselves, honestly. Do you think in Saudi Arabia protesters would not have their skulls cracked and thrown in jail? There was no Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia. Gee, I wonder why. Huh? No sanctions on Saudi Arabia, I wonder why. Or Israel, So this has nothing to do with democracy or human rights or protesting or whatever. This is about who's an ally and who is not, who's not taking orders and who's not obeying Western interests. They get slapped, they get smacked around, they get starved, bombed. That's what it's about, man. You've got to see it properly and not fall for this nonsense. This is a cover. This is nonsense. So... I'll just finish by saying that Cuba is pretty badass because they're 90 miles from the U.S. and they undertook a communist revolution and have managed to keep that revolution alive for over 60 years, despite, hundreds of attempts to subvert, to undermine their government. Just from a point of view of their resilience, it's quite a spectacle. It's quite admirable. And they are a true symbol of resistance and standing up to imperialism. And if you listen to that video by Stockwell, the CIA agent, he even admits that the CIA completely made up a lot of these myths like, Cubans eating babies or something like that. It's all propaganda. And so this is, again, another example of propaganda from the US against Cuba.